of the major topics that we, from time to time, hear people talk about on some of the Christian YouTube channels and in churches, people talk about what is known as the Great Tribulation. And the topic of discussion usually boils down to whether Christians, God's children, will be taken to heaven before the Great Tribulation or after the Great Tribulation. And I think a lot of people don't really know for sure, but what they do know is that if their pastor tells them that they're going to be taken before the Great Tribulation, then that's what they believe. And people who go to churches where the pastor says that the Christians are going to be taken after the Great Tribulation, that's what they believe. And I think that points to one thing, and that is, Peter, that a lot of Christians don't really take the time to study the subject of the second coming of Christ in the Bible on their own, and therefore they just leave it up to their pastors to formulate their opinions, and they just say, well, if he believes it, I'm going to believe it because I like my church. Is that a good enough reason to believe that Jesus is going to come before the tribulation or after the tribulation?
It's a start. The end time texts in the Bible are a bit of a patchwork of texts from different parts. So I think a lot of Christians, we say, okay, who has studied this and who can help me, kind of get an understanding of it. Of course, it doesn't take too long to read through it yourself. The Bible is a big book, but not too big to read through. And I certainly would agree if your point is that Christians should expect themselves to get an understanding on their own. I think it's definitely possible.
One thing we all believe is that Jesus will be coming back to take us up to heaven. Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, he says, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first." And in verse 17 it says, "Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord." So everybody agrees that that's how Jesus is going to come. He's going to come in the clouds, and he's going to have a great reaping, harvesting, and bring his children. I'd just like to, first of all, say that whatever we put out on our channel, we want to stick to the words in the Bible, and we want to base our beliefs on the words in this book. And in this case, we're going to go to Matthew chapter 24, when Jesus took his disciples up to the Mount of Olives, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives in Matthew 24 verse 3, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" So Jesus goes on and starts explaining to his disciples. We're not going to go over every single verse here, but if you'd like to do that on your own, Matthew chapter 24. So in Matthew chapter 24, in verse 29, Jesus says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days." So these are the words of Jesus now, talking about the tribulation. Is this talking about the Great Tribulation? It well could be. But Jesus says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." Peter, does that sound like Jesus is coming after the tribulation or before the tribulation? If that's talking about the Great Tribulation,
sure.
What is your take on that?
So, yeah, depending on, of course, which tribulation this is, Jesus is clearly coming back after it. That's the timeline he lays out. Now, of course, I want to point out that this message Jesus is giving his disciple, and he specifically says that this generation will not pass until all these things be fulfilled. And they all lived through this time when, as Daniel foretold, the prince would come, the sanctuary destroyed, all all that happened, and they took Jesus' words and they fled Jerusalem, and the church, by and large, survived that time. Now, I think the reason why we think there's still something more to it is because, of course, Jesus did not come back immediately after that. So I think that's why we think that Jesus could be talking about also another tribulation that is yet to come, after which he will come back.
There are some other very important pieces to the puzzle, and those pieces are found in the book of Revelation, which deals with the end of time as we know it, and the end time events as they will be, as they will come to pass. There are a lot of Christians that don't realize that in the book of Revelation, there are several chapters dedicated to what are called the 7 seals. And these seals are opened one by one. By the time we get to the 7th seal, 4 angels are on the 4 corners of the earth, and more angels come out, each angel having a trumpet, and they start sounding these trumpets.
Yeah.
And every time they sound a trumpet, something new happens.
And I think that these events that happen at that time are what we think of as the Great Tribulation, which will come before the coming of Christ.
Okay, so as the seals are open, obviously the white horse, that happened already, if Jesus represents the white horse. The black horse, which represents the merchants of the world, that has happened. It's going on right now. The red horse, which was the 2nd seal, represents war and killing and taking away the peace. By the time we get to the last seal, it definitely seems like we're getting close to the end of the world as we know it. In Revelation chapter 7, verse 3, God cries to the 4 angels on the corners of the earth and says, "Don't hurt the earth, the sea, or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads." So as the 7th seal is opened up, God makes sure that all of his people have a seal in their head to protect them from what is about to happen. So obviously at this point, God's children are still on earth, and these trumpets are about to be sounded. And as the trumpets are sounded in Revelation chapter 8 and 9, and then finally in 10, many bad things are happening in the world. The sun is darkened. The waters, the rivers on the earth have something called wormwood put into them, and the water becomes undrinkable. So there's a lot of bad stuff happening. But these are the 7 trumpets, and I think most Christians don't realize, if they were to wait and read a couple more chapters in the book of Revelation, they're going to find out that there are even worse things about to happen, and those things are called the 7 vials of the wrath of God, which are going to be poured out upon the earth. And so you have all of these bad things, which is the 7 trumpets.
Yeah.
In the 7th trumpet, also some interesting things happen. 2 witnesses come out dressed in sackcloth, and they witness their testimony of God. They're warning the world, and they are able to witness for 1,260 days. Where does the 1,260-day number come into relation with the Great Tribulation, or the tribulation period, if that's what this is talking about?
So I think Daniel mentions a similar number of days, 1,290 days, and there's another part of Revelation where it talks about this woman who has to flee into the wilderness.
Well, that's right here in the 7th trumpet.
Okay.
It's right here at the same time as the 2 witnesses are coming out witnessing for 1,260.
Same period then.
Same period. A woman is in travail, has a baby, a man-child. The baby is caught up into heaven and sits with God on the throne. That certainly seems like it was Jesus. And the woman flees into the wilderness and is protected by God. And this is in Revelation chapter 12. And it says, God has prepared a place for her and takes care of her for 1,260 days, 3.5 years. There is that number again. And at the same time, the dragon is cast out onto earth where he persecuted the woman, and the dragon, in Revelation chapter 12, verse 17, it says the dragon was wroth with the woman, went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So it seems definitely that the woman represents the people of God,
Yes.
and the dragon is after her, trying to get her.
Making war with the people
Right.
of God.
And all this happens within this period of time, which is mentioned twice in these chapters, 1,260 days, which just happens to be 3.5 years. So the teaching out there is that the last 3.5 years of this last 7-year period is the Great Tribulation. And some people are teaching that God's children will not have to go through that period of time, because there's a verse in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 which says the children of God are not appointed unto God's wrath.
Is that something that people cite about the tribulation?
Well, they have. I've heard it cited as part of the tribulation. And I totally agree with them, because I don't think we are appointed unto God's wrath.
Right.
And if you read on here in Revelation chapter 14, it talks about God's wrath. But guess what? Just before that happens, another angel comes out of the temple in chapter 14 of the book of Revelation, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, saying, "Trust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." And he that sat on the cloud, by the way, the guy on the cloud he's got a rainbow around his head. He has a golden crown. And when you look at his face, it looks like the sun. So he's a pretty special guy, and he's got this sickle. And he that sat on the cloud thrust his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle. And then in the next chapter comes the wrath of God. But what do you think this reaping means?
It certainly sounds like the gathering of God's people. Now, of course, there's going to be more than one event like that. Jesus talks about this time in his parables in Matthew 13, where the whole world will be reaped, and then the wheat separated from the tares. That parable. There is a time that Jesus talks about when all of his people will be gathered unto him, as he talks about in Luke 21, wherever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. That event, that sounds like similar to what Paul talks about in Thessalonians, and it sure seems like what we're hearing about here in Revelation.
As soon as the sickle is put in and the harvest is reaped, because it says that the harvest of the earth is ripe, then in the very next chapter in the book of Revelation comes the wrath of God, and these 7 terrible vials are poured out upon the earth, and we're not going to get into them here.
So then this is not talking about the reaping at the end of the world.
Not yet.
From Matthew 13. This is something, I think it has to be what we would call the rapture, from Thessalonians.
Our question to our viewers is, does it look like in Revelation chapter 14, when this guy who's sitting on a cloud, his face looks like a sun, he's got a golden crown, and there's a rainbow around his head, and he's reaping the last harvest? Is this the second coming of Christ? Is this talking about the rapture? And right after that, and this is, remember, this is the same woman that was sent into the wilderness, protected by God for 1,260 days.
While these things are happening.
While these things are happening. And before those 7 trumpets were sounded, which happens just before the sickle and the reaping, the people of God had been sealed to protect them from whatever the bad things were going to happen from these trumpets. So there is a great measure of protection for God's children who were here, obviously, and then they're reaped, and now the really, really bad stuff happens. Yes, if you want to call this the Great Tribulation, was it a bad period of time? It certainly was, because the dragon was cast down, obviously the abomination of desolation, the Antichrist. By the way, in this same period of time comes the mark of the beast, and all of that's happening at the same time. The two witnesses, the woman in the wilderness, the mark of the beast. You can't buy or sell anything unless you have the mark of the beast. It's a mark of a man, which is 666. All that is happening at the same time. And then in Revelation chapter 16, after the reaping comes the wrath of God. There's more in the book of Revelation which kind of lays out what happens after that, because Jesus is not finished yet. He's going to come back and he's going to make war with the Antichrist. And
so I have a question for you about this. Does that mean that Christians could at some point start counting down towards that reaping event?
Well, Jesus taught, if you go back to Matthew chapter 24, Jesus says, if you read on, he says, no man knows the day or the hour. And right after he says that, he says, as in the days of Noah, he says, and they didn't know that the flood was coming.
Right.
But guess who knew the flood was coming? Noah. He was building the ark for 120 years. And so the people didn't know the flood was coming. Their eyes were shut. Jesus talked about the blind leading the blind. So the people during Noah's time did not know that the flood was coming. And probably the people in the end time do not know that the end is coming. But guess who knew the flood was coming? Noah, because God told him. Could God's people know that they're getting close to the end because God tells them? Why not? As in the days of Noah. If we are trying to follow God as Noah tried to follow God, why would not God give us some advance warning? Do we know the day or the hour? No, we don't. The 1260-day period of time, I'm not sure, but we might be able to know that it's getting pretty close. We might not know the day or the hour, but we might get close to the month or the year, you know, and I hear a lot of people out there predicting the year that Jesus is going to come. We here are not going to say that, because things could get much worse before they get better. But what it does sound like here is that 1260-day period, which seems to be the last part of the last 7 years, the 70th week of the 70 weeks of Daniel. It sounds like there definitely were Christians, the woman who fled into the wilderness and was protected by God before the reaping.
Yeah.
So what do you say? Does it sound like Jesus is going to come and reap us before the wrath of God? Of course he is, because in Revelation 16, the woman's gone. All the Christians are gone. The Christians will not pass through the wrath of God. Obviously, it says that right here. And if you read on through the terrible things that happen in Revelation chapter 16, the wrath of God gets pretty bad. But guess what? The Christians were just taken and harvested and went up with Jesus. But could they go through the Great Tribulation, which is also a very bad time, but not anything like the wrath of God? Why do people think, Peter, that Christians do not have to suffer when Jesus said, if they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you?
Yeah.
All of the early apostles, except for John the Revelator, were all put to death and suffered persecution. All the Christians that met their death in the lion's den or in the Colosseum, why do Christians today think that they won't have to suffer persecution? Are we exempt from the persecution or those type of things? Or was that just special to the early Christian church? What do you think?
So Jesus spends a lot of his time telling his disciples what kind of persecutions they should expect. And and I think we largely do, we take Jesus' words as disciples as also applying to all believers from that time on. So I think we certainly know that Jesus expects his followers will receive persecution.
Whatever you believe on whether you think the church is going to be raptured before the tribulation or after the tribulation, our advice to you is go ahead and read through some of these chapters on your own in the book of Revelation and make your own conclusions, because it's not that cryptic. It's pretty clear. And if you have any questions or comments about what you've seen in this video, we certainly would like to hear them. So please leave your comments in that little space below. And if you have not yet subscribed to our channel, here's an invitation to do that. Thanks for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again next time.